everyone, and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm going to bring you my May reading wrap up. So I read 10 books in May, a lot of them historical fiction for the Historical Fiction Readathon that was hosted by Katie from Books and Things. I suppose before I get into the books, just to explain, you may have noticed that I'm somewhere different than usual, and that's because I am down in Cork for a few weeks looking after my aunt and uncle's dog while they're on holidays. So thanks to the miracle of working from home, I'm able to do that, but that does mean I don't have any of these books that I'm going to talk about with me because I didn't bring books that I'd already read. I still didn't manage to pack light, as you can see. I suppose here is a little preview of the book that I'll be picking from to read in the next few weeks. So with that, onto the books that I did read in May. So there's two books that I read that weren't historical fiction, so I'd actually almost finished them at the beginning of May, so I finished them off in the first few days. So the first one was actually the only book from the Women's Prize that I read, and that was Shardlake by Lulu, Allison. The cover caught my attention straight away, and the title, being from a farming background myself, I suppose I saw the cows, I heard there was a Greek chorus of cows. It's a strange title, I suppose, and it did quite amuse my family when they saw me reading a book called Shardlake. Yeah, I have to say it was disappointing on the whole, unfortunately for me. So the concept was really good. So it's very kind of dystopian type novel. It's very preoccupied with like environmental themes, like the sea levels have been rising. It's set in Britain and a lot of the land has already been kind of taken over from the sea. The parts of this book I really enjoyed most is the character Jesse. He's a young boy and it follows him as his family are trying to like cling on to their rural town and stay living there as it gets more and more difficult, and more and more houses are kind of being deserted as people do make that move to the city. Unfortunately, I didn't find the adult characters nearly so interesting, and I felt kind of distant from them. I think there was like too many, and I just wasn't really invested in them at all. I have to say I did enjoy the Greek chorus of the cows, so that did live up to its billing for me. I suppose just the novelty of it, I'm not sure how much they actually added to the story as a whole, but it was just interesting the things that they came out with. I'm not sure if I'd recommend it, but yeah, the concept definitely was fantastic. So the only other book I read that wasn't historical fiction was actually a biography of a historical figure, and that was Beloved Emma, The Life of Emma, Lady Hamilton by Flora Fraser. For some reason I find it so hard to say that title. But yeah, so it's what it says on the tin. It's a biography of Emma Hamilton, who I suppose is most famous now for being the mistress of Horatio Nelson, the famous admiral. Or maybe that's only me. Obviously, not being British, that's what I know her for anyways, but I'd say that wouldn't be an uncommon experience. But this biography really opened my eyes that was only such a tiny part of her life, and she'd such an interesting life as well, like a very hard life, but just to, I suppose, arise from quite humble origins, difficult teenage years, I suppose, as she went under the protection of various men. She had her first daughter, Emma Carew, when she was 13, and didn't have much contact with her. Emma Carew seems like a fascinating character in herself, but unfortunately I don't think a lot is known about her. Emma Hamilton obviously comes from her marriage to William Hamilton, who was a British ambassador in the court of Naples. It's hard to believe, really. It was so fantastic. She was actually more or less passed to him by his nephew when his nephew got kind of tired of her. William Hamilton was a good bit older than her, but by all accounts, they did seem to have had quite a happy marriage. And obviously she had her famous affair with Nelson while she was married to him, but we can never know for certain. But it does appear that William Hamilton did know about that and consent. She's obviously famous for her attitudes. I put the inverted commas there because it's not like an attitude like we'd call it now. It was like she would drape herself in shawls and things and pretend to be Greek figures, and just the contemporary accounts of this from letters of people that saw her do them and things. They were so astounded, and it seems to have been a really big talent. You'd love to see it now, and just it's hard to imagine, really. You see paintings of that, but people were just so gobsmacked, I suppose, when they didn't have films and things, and there was a big interest in antiquity at that time. They'd probably see it different than we would now, but yeah, it's just interesting, I suppose. Obviously a lot of the paintings of Emma Hamilton are very famous. George Romney painted her over many years, and I suppose one criticism I would have of this book is like it's just the format, but I'd love to have like seen I'd love for there to have been like way more pictures in this book. Like I kept having to Google the paintings that Flora Fraser was talking about. There are some pictures in the book, only the kind of standard 2 sections that you get in those type of non-fiction books. I suppose she had quite a tragic end. Famously, Nelson kind of bequeathed Emma to his country, and like in the expectation that she'd be taken care of when he died, but she wasn't. She doesn't come across very well in later life. She seems to have like had extremely bad financial acumen. Her treatment of her second daughter by Nelson, Horatia, doesn't really come across too nicely either, I have to say. This is also really kind of a fascinating like insight into the time. Things I suppose that are never reproduced like exactly in historical fiction because we probably wouldn't believe it. Almost hysterical letters and things that were written at the time when Nelson's naval victories were coming in, and that like the outpouring of emotion that there was, and just people fainting, and just like kind of real portrait of like the sensibility of the time, I suppose. Yeah, a very interesting book, and I don't read many biographies, and then I always wonder why I don't. They're just as good as fiction. People that have that led such interesting lives. This biography was extremely detailed. A lot of it did go over my head, I have to say. There was a lot about the Naples court that I didn't know anything about. I never studied classics. I don't even know the basics of like Roman or Greek mythology or anything. Worth reading if you're interested in the period, or especially if you're interested in Nelson or anything, because that really does give you a balanced view of kind of the other side as well, I suppose. So I suppose I was interested in this as well. So I was in England earlier on in the year. I brought the car, so we obviously sailed across from Ireland and landed in Wales, and then we're driving from Wales down to Cornwall. We stayed 2 nights in hotels in Wales, and both of them, pure coincidentally, kind of marketed themselves to have been kind of places of retreat that Emma Hamilton and Nelson had stayed. So yeah, I didn't find any references to those hotels here, but it's always nice to have those local legends. But it did probably make me pick up this book a little bit quicker as well. So in terms of related biographies I'd like to read, I do have a biography of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire as well, who is mentioned in this book and is from a similar period and also had a very exciting life. So on to the historical fiction books, I suppose. So I'm going to do them in the usual order of like the period in which they're set, and not the order of the prompts or anything, but I'll say out the prompts as I met them. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Dissolution by C.J. Sansom. This is the first book in the Shardlake series that I've been looking forward to reading for quite a while, and I happened to see this in a charity shop, so I picked it up, and it was absolutely brilliant. So Matthew Shardlake is one of the commissioners for like looking at the monasteries in the Reformation in the court of Henry VIII. He is assisted by this boy who he has to take under his wing for various reasons, called Mark. They're sent by Thomas Cromwell to look into the murder of this other commissioner at a monastery that he was evaluating as part of his job, and it was such a good murder mystery. Like, it's that best kind of murder mystery where it's like very claustrophobic, and the atmosphere, it was absolutely brilliant. You get a description of the monastery, which is remote, and it's set in these marshes. There's smugglers, there's the monks themselves. They all have kind of different characters. Some are likeable, some obviously aren't likeable. They all have their different motives, and there's the kind of threat of dissolution hanging over the monastery all the time, and all of the way that the different kind of monks react to that. Like, some of them see it as an opportunity. Some of them are just so understandably distraught at how hundreds of years of tradition is being taken away, and that their lives are going to be, changed forever. Some of them are very elderly. Matthew Shardlake has a hunchback, so the way he sees his own disability and the way other characters react to him is obviously very interesting. He is a very sympathetic character on the whole. I suppose a character that wasn't sympathetic and was interesting after having read the Wolf Hall trilogy last year was the portrayal of Thomas Cromwell, who definitely is portrayed as a lot more of a villain in this series. So yeah, on the whole, just such a good book, so many twists, really engrossing, and I absolutely can't wait to read the next book in the series whenever I manage to pick it up. If you liked the Wolf Hall trilogy, I would say that this book isn't nearly so challenging to read, but still really gives you that historical detail. Obviously different kind of area than Hilary Mantel focused on. She was very preoccupied with the court, and this so far at least seems to be kind of more on the lower and middle classes, and here obviously it was in a monastery, which the Reformation is interesting to read about and just the big impact it had. So that was definitely a highlight of the month for me as well. So that met the prompt to read from a period that you were less familiar with. I haven't read much about the Tudors at all, but I can understand why people love them so much. It is very interesting. So the next book I'm going to talk about was to fulfill the prompt to read a historical fiction set in your own country. I was lucky to pick up this book actually because I read a lot of my Irish historical fiction in March for the Irish Readathon, so I didn't have any books on my shelf that could have immediately fulfilled this prompt. But I saw this book in a charity shop that was actually dedicated to just children's books, which was interesting, and I've never been there before. But that's the Powder Monkey by Bill Walsh. So obviously when I saw this cover I had to pick it up straight away. It was really fun, short little read. What's interesting about it as well, it was actually appears to have been a teacher's copy, so like at the end of every chapter there were like questions. But definitely was kind of flashbacks to my primary school days. This is about a young boy who's very badly treated by his uncle. In the grand tradition of young boys in stories, runs away to sea. He joins a British ship, and they've kind of become embroiled in the events surrounding the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, which was kind of an uprising by the United Irishmen in Ireland, especially kind of around the east and southeast of the country, and then later up in the west in Mayo when 1,000 French troops actually landed, but it did ultimately end badly as usual. It obviously, because it's a children's book, it was like quite simplistic, I suppose, in terms of the characters, and I would have liked to have seen a bit more character depth from Donal. It is part of a trilogy, and I imagine it's not a very easy book to get my hands on, but if I did see the other two I would pick them up, just because I imagine like Donal will be getting older and you'd expect he'd have more complicated feelings about things. So it was an interesting one and a nice little find. So there was another prompt to read a book from your favourite time period. Obviously most of the books on this list fall kind of within the Regency or Georgian period, which is probably my favourite time period to read about. But I suppose to really, in the spirit of this prompt, it kind of had to be a nautical adventure. So I picked up Enemy in Sight by Alexander Kent. This was, I suppose, a bit of a strange choice because it's number 13 in the Bolitho series, but it was the one that I saw in a charity shop when I was there, and I decided I didn't care much about spoilers. But I have to say, I have never seen such a strange decision by a publisher in my life. So when I say I didn't care about spoilers, I meant like things that had happened in previous books. But anybody that does consider this edition of these books, on the first page of the book here, there's a list of all of the books in the series, which go right up to like 26 or 27, and the year that they take place in, fair enough, but also contains seriously massive spoilers for books later on in the series that were absolutely gobsmacking to read. Even stranger, like the book finished here, and often there's like blurbs of the next book in the series here. No, it didn't show the blurb for the next book in the series. It showed the blurb for like book 18 or 19, which had an absolutely enormous spoiler for the intermediate books. It was baffling. I never saw anything like it. But anyways, apart from that, I really enjoyed this book. I have to say, Bolitho he's very typical hero for these kind of books, I suppose, but I enjoyed it for what it was. The writing was really good, the storyline was good, I liked the way things were described, it was easy to follow. There obviously was reference to a lot of backstory that I hadn't got up to that point, but it was fine. I could still follow the events perfectly fine, and I really enjoyed that this book series seems to be kind of set earlier on than is usual for like the Aubrey Maturin books or anything. It's kind of set in the 1790s. So yeah, it was just interesting to see that different perspective. But yeah, I definitely will be picking up more books in the series. It's a pity that the publisher felt the need to do such massive spoilers like that. But yeah, so the next book I'm going to talk about is Remarkable Creatures by Tracey Chevalier, which I buddy read with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, and I'm happy to say that we both really enjoyed it. I would say that I unreservedly loved this book, which is a good thing to say. Tracey Chevalier, I've only read one book from her before, but I just know I'm going to enjoy all of her books, and I've already have one more on my shelf. I'm on the lookout for more because just the way she writes and the things she writes about. Like, I mean, this book is focused on two real historical figures, so it met that prompt for the Historical Fiction Readathon, Mary Anning and Elizabeth Philpott. Personally, I'd heard of Mary Anning before, but I hadn't heard of Elizabeth. The book is set in Lyme Regis, and they are fossil hunters. Lyme Regis is kind of set along the Jurassic coast, and it's very, very well known for kind of these fossil finds, and some very significant discoveries were made in the area. I did visit Lyme before, but at the time I suppose I was more interested in it for the Jane Austen connection, but I'd love to go back now that I have this extra background in the fossils. Yeah, so I suppose from the science perspective, it was really interesting. Paleontology is fascinating, I suppose, and I suppose this period kind of captured the start of when people were trying to think about what these fossils meant. There's a lot of kind of conflict in this book, mostly, within characters' heads about what finding these fossils that people kind of suspected were really, really old, what that meant for the creation story in terms of religion and of the flood and that. Where are these species now? Why did they disappear? Why did God allow that to happen? That was interesting, but I was just really impressed, like the book I previously read by her, A Single Thread, by like kind of how much research that Tracey Chevalier had done into all of this and how knowledgeable she was about it, the different types of fossils, what made a good fossil, how to recover them from the rock. When I say this is about the real historical figures, Mary and Elizabeth, I would say most characters in this book were based on real figures, and whenever I came across a new one, I had to keep googling to check whether it was a real person or not, and most of them were, and very interesting characters as well. Some that you'd recognise, like William Buckland, who was a very strange figure, I suppose, and all of the things that are in the book with him, he actually appears to have been like that. And Tracey Chevalier does include a fascinating little note at the end, kind of closing out some of the characters in terms of what actually happened to them if their story wasn't closed out in the book. But the characters were the heart of this book. It was kind of told through two narrators. So it was told by Mary and Elizabeth, and they were both from different classes. Like Mary would have been kind of very working class, and then Elizabeth is kind of, I suppose, one of the gentry who's been forced through her brother's marriage to live in reduced circumstances with her sisters. The Philpott sisters, I love the way their household was portrayed. There was three of them and all of their kind of different interests and tensions. There was the sisters, but the main attraction of this book for me definitely was the friendship between Mary and Elizabeth. As I said, it was kind of a cross-class friendship. I love the way they kind of tried to work that out and the way that evolved over time. They're both fossil hunters, but I suppose they're kind of approaching it from different angles due to that, the way they kind of helped each other out. Yeah, I've so much to say about this book. I suppose I hadn't done a buddy read before, but it was great just to read it a bit slower and hear Marissa's opinion as well. So I don't want to go into everything, or else this video will be impossibly long, but I do really, really recommend this book, Remarkable Creatures. Don't be intimidated if you don't know anything about paleontology or fossils or anything. It's written in a really accessible way, and it is just such a wonderful story of female friendship. And I know that's something that people on BookTube say that they love to read about a lot. So and also kind of strong sister connections. So yeah, it's a must read for if you enjoy those kind of things. And yeah, I so look forward to reading more Tracey Chevalier. The next book, I suppose, is also based on real events in a much smaller way, and that's the Warlow Experiment by Alix Nathan. The inspiration was taken from a real newspaper advert that offered somebody a sum of money per year for life if they were willing to live somewhere away from all human contact for 7 years. And it is known from the research the author did, they did get a candidate and somebody actually did do that for 4 years. So yeah, this book was a very strange book. It's kind of told again from two perspectives, from the man who sent the advert that wants to do the study, who is Mr. Powers, and then the man who undertakes to live in these conditions. So apart from that, which obviously is fascinating and disturbing, it's like Mr. Powers like living his everyday life above while the man is locked below, as the cover shows very well, if I can put a picture of it up here. But there's also kind of a lot of discussion about like the influence of print at the time and the publication of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. I suppose it's inevitable when you do read this book to wonder how you would fare in those circumstances, and it's actually one of the reading group questions at the end that they sometimes put in. And yeah, like I suppose if you have any thoughts, leave it below. Like 7 years is a long time. I suppose we might manage okay for a little while if you had plenty of books and this man is provided with books and things and good food. But I think what I would find hardest is there are no windows, so you can't see the difference between night and day, and that would definitely be very difficult. But yeah, a very strange book. But yeah, I'm not sure if enjoyable is the right word, but it certainly was interesting and fascinating that it was based on a real advert. So the next book then I'm going to talk about is Gifts by Liz Hyder. So this book I read for the prompt to read a historical fiction with kind of a speculative element. I actually read this in one day in a Saturday, which is a recommendation for any book, I suppose. It was so fast paced and so many twists. So I suppose the premise is, and the very first opening of the book is, this woman is stumbling through a wood and she finds that she has sprouted wings from her back, and obviously people become interested in that, and there's all kind of speculation about angels and that. So as I say, I really enjoyed this book. There were so many kind of really interesting characters and the interactions between them. The only thing I have to say though is there was so many characters and they were all so great. I wanted more time with all of them, do you know, but because you were following so many different viewpoints, you didn't really get that. But I'm not even sure if that's a real criticism, because it was so well written. Like, I mean, as I say, there were so many viewpoints. I can't remember how many, but they were all like very distinct. You could tell exactly whose point of view you were reading from, even without looking at like the chapter symbol. So that was something that was so nice about the design of this book, I suppose. That there were like pictures in it, which is always nice for a book, that if there are drawings or pictures in them. But instead of the name being on the header of a chapter, it was like a symbol for that character. So like a feather, or I think one was a pen, or you know, things like that. So yeah, definitely a great book if you like kind of a speculative element to your historical fiction. So the last book that I finished in May, that I'm going to talk about, it was for the prompt to read a classic work of historical fiction. I was running out of time for this prompt, so I picked a novella, and it was from a collection of novellas by Elizabeth Gaskell that I had on my e-reader, and I decided to read The Poor Clare. Yeah, this is a short little novella. It's kind of about this young woman who is living under a curse. I won't go into the curse because it's best just to go into this book without knowing much. I suppose the only thing I was a bit disappointed in this book about is because The Poor Clare, that's an order of nuns. I thought it might be about nuns, and it wasn't. There is a slight element of nuns towards the end, but it was really interesting. Soon after I finished that, I came across Roz from Scallydandling About the Books video about why she liked books about nuns, and I got loads of good recommendations out of that. So yeah, definitely a video to check out if you are interested in books on nuns. And the last book I'm going to mention then is Islands by Dan Sleigh. So I had intended for this book to meet the prompts to read a historical fiction book over 500 pages and to read a book that wasn't set in your own country. So obviously all of the books apart from one that I read were set outside of Ireland, but I suppose to challenge myself and to keep more in the spirit with the prompt, I wanted to extend that to be outside Ireland and the UK. This book is translated from the Afrikaans, and it's set in South Africa, kind of back in the 1700s during the colonisation of South Africa, I suppose, especially by the Netherlands. I enjoyed some aspects of this book, and I did read nearly 300 pages. It's a very long book, but it was quite slow moving. It's kind of told through the mechanism of 7 men who came into contact with this woman, so the perspective kind of changed every 100 or 200 pages, which stopped feeling too much of a connection with the characters. Yeah, it just wasn't the book for me at the time, and I did DNF it after I thought I'd given it a good chance. But I did learn a good bit even from the 300 pages that I did read, and I'll keep it on my shelves for now at least, just if I do want to go back and explore it again. So yeah, that's it. I would say on the whole I had a good reading month. I did read some really good books in there as well as some more like mediocre ones. So yeah, it was nice, I suppose, to kind of have more focused reading for historical fiction this month, even though I do probably read majority historical fiction every month anyways. So thanks to Katie for hosting that read along, and yeah, so thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.